We're going to have a small group tonight, and but I think a good discussion based on what we've talked about many times in the past. So welcome to the 26th session in the world of speculative fiction. We're both old hands at this, so I don't have to say what we're going to do. We'll talk a little bit about the biography of Camp, and then jump into world building and some philosophical themes. I had 5 that I thought were kind of interesting in terms of these particular novels, and what we're talking about with Sprague de Camp is the Compleat Enchanter. Actually, we should have the Compleat Enchanter, which has all 5 stories, but this is the one that I could get my hands on here in the Milwaukee area. And it's kind of a misnomer because these are written with Fletcher Pratt, who we'll talk about a bit as well. I first read these myself only about in the last 10 years. I'd read a lot of Sprague de Camp in other contexts, but I'd never read these. And when we were still in Kingston, I found the Compleat Enchanter. I thought that looks kind of interesting. I was poking through the sci-fi stuff. And so I started reading it, and I was like, wow, this is really great stuff. Well written, very imaginative, and extremely funny. So I thought it would make a good set of things to talk about, in part because there is it's not one single world, but it isn't a coherent narrative universe all held together by this notion of symbolic logic of all things, which could never work the way that they're representing, right? But we'll talk about that in a bit. But I thought it was such a fun series that it would be good to do for this. He's been very influential, and he's had connections with quite a few of the people who we've been looking at. He actually worked in the Philadelphia Naval Yard with Asimov and Heinlein for a while. During World War II, there were a number of these guys who wound up contributing to the war effort, not as combatants, but they put their brains to work.
As scientists, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So you want to should we go over the
Sure.
timeline first? So, he's born in 1907, dies in 2000, so a very long life. And he's the L is lion. That's what he was named after. He was born in New York City, and then eventually he gets sent as a kid to this Snyder School in North Carolina. He was not a real fan of it, but he went there, and then he starts going to Caltech, right? California Institute of Technology, and he like a lot of these people that were studying in this time. He earns degrees in technical fields that require a lot of mathematics. I think, the training at that time probably would have been, in certain respects, more similar to what we do in the humanities, although there would have been an intensive, math and science component. Not like, what a lot of our kids are learning today, where they just get put off on their own track, and they don't do very much with that. And he ends up earning a bachelor's in science and aeronautical engineering. That's quite an accomplishment. Earns his master's in engineering. Starts working doing patent stuff, which is rather dull but pays the bills. And you notice this is in the middle of the Depression, so any work is good. And he starts publishing in 1937, so he's 30 years old. And pulp work. These all showed up in pulps as well. And then he gets fired from editing this trade journal, and he said, well, that was actually a good thing for me because then I could start focusing on really writing. He marries this woman, Catherine Crook, who would also work as his rewrite editor and sometimes collaborator during the rest of their years together. And he meets Fletcher Pratt, who's going to become his major collaborator. As a matter of fact, the reason why Fletcher Pratt's going to die in 1956, and there were plans to write more of these novels, and they had some things already plotted out. It just really wasn't possible for Sprague de Camp to pull off what he was doing without Pratt. He tried writing some stuff with some other guys, but it just never came out right. And you notice now he's starting to write more and more stuff. The Incomplete Enchanter comes out, and that includes, I've got this on this chart here, the first two big stories, The Roaring Trumpet and The Mathematics of Magic. And so those are both from 1940, and so you've got kind of a thin volume. But it gives you enough of what's going on in the universe for people to have an idea about it. And then the third story is published in 1941, and the Compleat Enchanter is going to come out a bit later on. And then later on they'll have the Complete Enchanter, which has the fourth and fifth story in it. But you notice he's writing a lot of stuff throughout the 40s and 50s. Just one year he's extremely prolific, 1953. He's also writing a lot of other stuff that I didn't put in there. He writes nonfiction works. He was quite active in you could say, kind of bringing to the masses, what science, the sort of stuff that went out in popular science, for example, or popular mechanics. That whole sort of culture of the world is complicated, but science can help us understand it. He was very involved with that. And he starts winning some awards. 1953 wins an International Fantasy Award for non-fiction. He brings out a writing guide, the Science Fiction Handbook. So he's clearly somebody who's thinking about not just how to write stories, but about the craft itself, which I think is kind of interesting. And he's involved in that saga group, the Swordsmen and Sorcerers Guild of America. I can't find out. Maybe but I can't find out when it was actually founded. People list different dates. Yeah. Somewhere between 61 and 65. So I put 63 on this. But that shows you who he's connected with. And he even writes a thing later on, Literary Swordsmen and Sorcerers, about the group. So that's in 76, about maybe 15 years later. He also has a biography of Lovecraft in there, which I haven't read, but I'm looking forward to getting to read sometime, because that sounds quite interesting. And, you see that, again, I didn't put all of his works in here. He's not writing an awful lot of fiction later on. He's writing more science fiction. But he does some interesting things. He gets some awards. They move to Texas. They travel to Easter Island. And his life is fairly straightforward and sedate in many ways. I did have a few things that got talked about by other people. For example, George R. Martin, right? George R. Martin, who we looked at a couple years ago, said, "When I was a kid in grade school who dreamed of telling stories, I found Sprague de Camp's Science Fiction Handbook in the Bayonne Public Library. His how-to book inspired me so much I would take it out every few months and read it all over again." And I've looked at sections of it. He is providing sort of like here's how to actually do the craft, which is kind of interesting. He also did have a bit of a time editing Conan novels.
Well, I saw Conan the Adventurer was in here.
Yeah. Well,
and Tales of Conan.
He wrote some stuff himself, and he was hired to edit the stuff, but he rewrote typescripts, and then he censored some parts. He rewrote Howard's stories, adding new characters, and sometimes he modified it considerably. So And we're going to talk about this when we get to Howard, who we're going to do later on, I think this summer. How much of Howard is actually Howard and how much of it is other people. He also did meet Tolkien at one point. I remember coming across this. He said, "We sat in the garage for a couple of hours, smoking pipes, drinking beer, and talking about a variety of things. Practically anything in the English literature, from Beowulf down, Tolkien had read and could talk intelligently about." He indicated he rather liked Howard's Conan stories. So, quite interesting there. And I don't think there's that much more to say in terms of biography. And there's a lot more to say about this world that he's creating. So, I mentioned it's not a world; it's a whole set of worlds. Sort of like what Lewis did with the Magician's Nephew, where you've got this juncture point where you can get out of this world and then you can go into all these other worlds. And Lewis has his characters explore a few of those. That's something similar to what's going on here, except it begins in this world, and they're having like a conversation where they reveal how things are going to come out, and it's a conversation between the very smart scientists, although they're all psychologists, and the brash guy who's a little bit of an overcompensator, who's going to be the main hero, the Harold Shea of the Harold Shea stories. And they're going back and forth about, could other worlds exist? And so, in these novels, they call it paraphysics, the physics beyond the physics that we have. And the way in which you would get yourself into another world is by using symbolic logic. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that's supposed to work, which couldn't possibly work like that. But it's an interesting plot device, and it's basically, connected with this notion that we see coming up over and over again in philosophy, that the world that we're experiencing right now is in large part a construct of how we're projecting order onto the world. So you and I are sharing this room here, and it might actually look very different to you than it does to me, but I don't know that until you start talking about it or behaving in the room. And even then, I'm probably going to keep on believing that you're perceiving it exactly the same way, because we like regularity. But maybe all of this is just a sort of Jamesian booming, buzzing confusion that we're projecting these categories onto that we're just used to, or this is the way our minds have to work. But it could be read in very different ways. So, think about somebody coming from Norse mythology, which is the first place where they go to. There you've got a world where people perceive things in very different ways, and most importantly, magic works. In our world, magic doesn't work. We've got magicians who do tricks, but we think that magic itself is not something lurking in the background in this world, and they're perfectly happy with that. But in the other worlds, magic would work, and so you all you have to do is think yourself into a different set of rules. Use what Harold Shea calls a syllogism mobile. An argument, essentially, that would be like a big construct of all the rules of that world, and you're suddenly in that world and you're experiencing it. So, like in the first one, it's the world of Norse mythology. He's actually trying to get into the Irish mythology world because he wants to hang out with Irish girls, and it doesn't work. Instead, he winds up stuck with these Norse gods, leading up to Ragnarok. Then in the second one, it's Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, and they actually get themselves into the story, or the land of the story rather, not the story so much, because the story is more linear, right? And if you think about how this is supposed to work, it's sort of like, I guess it's sort of like what people really like about video games, you know? Like if you have the Lord of the Rings, for example, and that's a linear story, and there's a lot of, you know, digressions here and there, and you know, unfinished parts sometimes. But it, you know, more or less has a beginning, middle, and end, right? But if you're in a game that's just populated with, you know, there's orcs over there and elves over there, and you can pick out, do you want to be a dwarf, do you want to be a half-elf, do you want to be this or that? There's a lot more scope for play. I guess that, you know, sort of like what people were really getting into with role-playing games too, you know? So, I mean, that's what becomes possible within these worlds is an exploration of it. In the third one, there's a brief interlude where they wind up in Coleridge's Kubla Khan for a brief bit and realize they better get the hell out of there because it's an unfinished poem and, you know, they're going to be in trouble. So they go into Aristo's Orlando Furioso, the world of that as well. And then they finally get into other worlds in the later stories, the world of the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic, and then finally the world of Irish mythology. And each one has got its own little construct. Each one has the way things work in there, you know. So the magicians do things differently from world to world, although there are similarities. So, you know, in theory, anything that we could imagine, there's going to be some actual world out there that corresponds to it. So, you know, all the things that we've been discussing in these sessions, every single one of them, I guess, you know, if you could
the multiverse.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is a multiverse, and the way that Chalmers talks about it is that all these places do exist within the same space, the space that we're occupying right now, but they're at sort of, he describes it as at right angles with each other, which is not particularly helpful, I think, for trying to visualize it. But he also says anything that a poet or fiction author is picturing to themselves is actually, like, it's connected in some way to a world. So if you start writing a novel and you're exercising your imagination, and I don't know, you know, what's your novel going to look like? You know, maybe you know, we're talking about people having psionic powers and things like that. There have to be certain rules for that, and then you start doing the world building part. You know, well, who's going to be in charge? Are there conflicts? You know, what's the geography like? Well, as soon as you start imagining that, your imagination is actually like syncing up with something that is out there that does exist, and you can move from world to world. So, I mean, you could see a lot of possibility for abuse, I think, right? But, you know, you could see a lot of other interesting possibilities as well.
Well, it sounds like it relates to in Irish mythology, the concept of thin spaces.
Well, tell me about that, because I don't know that.
In Celtic mythology, the idea is that twice a year, Beltane and Samhain.
Oh, okay.
The space between this world and the next becomes a thin place, a thin space, and it's easier to cross.
But is that just for like the land of the living and the land of the dead?
Well, it's the land of the living and the land of
something else.
Something else.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the dead.
Okay.
It's something more metaphysical, more.
Oh.
You know, spirits, or it could be, you could call it the land of the dead, but it could also be another dimension of existence. When the thin space happens,
but something that's more essential, something that's more, in some ways, more real than what we're
Well,
experiencing here?
it's like the land of fairy.
Okay,
It's the difference between here and the land of fairy.
yeah,
Because the other side is where the hunting god, the hunter, comes from, and the queen of fairy.
yeah,
And so it's the concept that a couple times a year, crossing is easier,
yeah,
that it can be crossed at other times of the year, but the thin spaces happen a couple times a year where crossing is much easier. And you can cross accidentally if you're not careful.
yeah. So what happens in this is it's not based on time. It's based on the actions of the people involved. There's two ways that people wind up moving between worlds. One is through, like, I mean, literally putting together reams of paper with formulas on them, where it's supposed to represent the world that you're trying to get into. That's how they first do it. And then once somebody's in the other world and they understand what they're doing, they can put out like a call that sucks other people from this world into that world, which is what happens with Chalmers bringing Shea and what is his name, the Czech guy, Vaclav Polacek, the rubber Czech they call him, into the other world, along with a police officer who's trying to arrest them, who's not really happy about being stuck there. But yeah, so it's almost like you generate the thinness, right?
Mm-hmm. But there's a formula to generate the thinness.
Yeah, and so now here we started. This is a good jumping off point to talk about, is some of this stuff actually coherent or not? So we've got a multiverse, and it's got all these different settings and people in it, and what's most important, the way that these characters represent it, is the sort of fundamental laws undergirding it that tell you how that world works. So I mean, this actually does make a lot of sense, say, with like computer simulations, where the computer simulation really is defined primarily by the laws that say how, say, gravity works, or how, if you shoot a projectile at somebody, do they have hit points that you take away, or things like that. I don't know that works so well with entire worlds, if we're saying that these are also real worlds or not. And there, the other thing that goes along with this too is there would be no single like central point that would be, like for the characters there is a central point, Earth. Mm-hmm. But every one of these worlds would be just as real as the others. So the world of Norse mythology is just as real as the world of the Fairy Queen, just as real as the world that we're in, just as real as some sci-fi universe. Like, say, the Star Trek universe, right?
Well, as you're talking, what I think about is there's a series of books by Tad Williams called the Otherland series. Okay. And in that world is created mathematically through a virtual reality game system.
So it exists in a world, though, already, right? In which the virtual reality is cited.
There's this world.
Yeah.
And then the connection through virtual reality to Otherland. Yeah. And Otherland actually becomes real.
Now, real in what sense? That's the kicker, right?
Kids are drawn into it mentally by the connection to the VR.
Yeah.
But if they die in Otherland, they die here.
Okay.
And it's a very long plot line, but it's multiple worlds. Otherland is multiple worlds. They cross over because the gaming systems have different worlds. So within this Otherland system, there's multiple worlds.
Yeah. In that case, though, each of the multiple worlds is still sort of like what's called a local world within a larger unified system.
But they're created mathematically and logically by creating the virtual reality system.
Yeah. So in this, I mean, we don't get many examples other than like a little bit of sort of logical. It's kind of gobbledygook at the beginning of each of these where, okay, so here's an example. In the very first one, the Roaring Trumpet, Harold Shea is, he's got himself set up. So this is actually kind of good to talk about. He says he got himself a flashlight, a gun, with plenty of ammunition, a hunting knife, a box of matches, a Gaelic dictionary because he thinks he's going to Ireland, and the Boy Scout handbook, and he's got all this stuff set up with him. And then he starts writing logical equations. And this is the stuff that we're used to from like symbolic logic classes,
Mm-hmm.
So here's how it reads. He says, if P equals not Q, Q implies not P, which is equivalent to saying either P or Q or neither but not both. But if not P is not implied by not Q, the counter-implicative form of the proposition, and then it goes on and on. And then he starts going into other more complex stuff. The full argument thus consists in an epichrematic syllogism in Barbara, the major premise of which is not the conclusion of an enthymeme, though the minor premise of which may not be the conclusion of a non-Aristotelian Sorites, Now, so
you can see why it would appeal to you.
Good. Well, here's the thing, though. So when you're reading that, you're like, well, this is actually nonsense. He's not. I mean, whatever he is saying, this could not be the representation of a world. So we have to do some suspension of disbelief, right? Mm-hmm. In order to make it work. I mean, but if we think about it in a larger sense, so he does bring up a little bit earlier when they're going back and forth, because this is a smart way of introducing the whole premise that gets them going with paraphysics. Chalmers says, here we go. If in one of these infinite other worlds, which up to now may be said to exist in a logical but not an empirical sense, is governed by magic, you might expect to find a principle like that of dependence invalid, the logical thing in our world, but principles of magic, such as the law of similarity, valid. Bayard says, what's the law of similarity? Effects resemble causes. It's not valid for us, but primitive peoples firmly believe it. For instance, they think you can make it rain by pouring water on the ground with appropriate mumbo jumbo. And Shea says, I didn't know you could have fixed principles of magic. And Chalmers says, certainly, medicine men don't merely go through hocus pocus. They believe they're working through natural laws. So in a world where everybody firmly believed in these laws, and here we get some of the metaphysics, that is one where all minds were attuned to receive the proper impressions, the laws of magic would conceivably work, as one hears of witch doctors' spells working in Africa today. Fraser, so the Golden Bough guy, right, and Seabrook, who I don't actually know, have worked out some of these magical laws. Another is the law of contagion. Things once in contact continue to interact from a distance after separation. And so what he's laying out are, what could be produced as sort of an exhaustive listing of these laws. But notice what he's done there. He's referred to stuff in this world, people who in this world believe this stuff actually works. Now, why would they have those beliefs? In our world where we say, well, science and symbolic logic rules, those people are just primitive or they're deluded or something like that. But there is a world corresponding to them where their beliefs would be the normal and everybody in it. So if we think about, he's using, people who were considered primitive at that time, maybe indigenous tribes. But if we think back to the examples that he's using, like Norse mythology, and believing in the magic and it's called like the structure of the divine of that time, where the gods themselves aren't really that godlike in many respects. They can get killed. They can be beaten up by giants. There's all sorts of problems. They can get tricked by magic themselves. You could represent that in some way. You could lay out what the rules are, and then by thinking yourself into those rules, you would thereby place yourself in that space. And so the question is, people in this world, were the people, the Norse at the time that they believed there was going to be a Ragnarok and they believed in Odin and Thor, were they somehow participating in that world that's not an imaginary world then, but a real world, and just didn't realize it? Is the process of civilization maybe like a sort of homogenization of this world that we're in? We're talking about disenchantment, taking all the magic out of the world. The way people complain that the modern era is one where we turned everything into the knowable.
It took away the magic.
Yeah. I mean, he's not saying that here, but that would seem to be part of the background metaphysics of it.
Well, it strikes me, have you read Philip Rothfuss's works?
No.
He's got 2 books out. We're still waiting for the 3rd. But it's arcane knowledge. It's alchemy.
Okay.
It's tied with the alchemy. Not so much magic. I mean, people perceive it as magic.
Yeah.
Because it's so different.
Yeah.
But it's alchemy, and there's a school of arcane knowledge.
And so there's a method to it.
There's a method to it, and part of the method, when you talk about connection,
yeah,
part of the method in the teachings, you have to have a strong mental belief in what's going to happen. If you don't, it doesn't happen.
See, now that brings up a really interesting
So that
point.
Mental,
yeah,
in your head, you have to believe that this works.
Yeah. That's not something that I was actually thinking about as a theme, but that actually is a good theme. So the characters who are like exist in fairyland, right? Like Bethelga, who's going to become the wife of Shea a little bit later on. She grew up in there. Her mind works according to those laws of fairyland, and she's never known anything different. So it's not a problem for her. But the people like Shea and Chalmers who get themselves into fairyland, in order to get themselves there, they have to convince themselves of this way of looking at things. They have to adopt a completely different perspective than what they're used to. And yet, in order to be able to have not lose themselves in it and still have kind of, let's call it a critical perspective, because that would be the technical term for it, where they can engage in judgment. They couldn't completely buy into it, right? So they're caught. I mean, how do they do that? Do they oscillate back and forth? Do they look at it both ways at the same time? Do they have like a higher perspective where they're choosing between perspectives? This is one of the difficulties in
or do they
conceptualizing.
believe it enough to exist, but not to operate the magic?
Well, they do operate the magic, and that's the interesting part. And it takes them a while to figure out precisely how to do it. There's a learning curve, you could say, right? And it turns out that Chalmers is way better at it than Shea is. Chalmers is kind of a bookish type. He's older. He's the sort of fatherly figure, but he falls in love with somebody else in the other world too.
Well, a learning curve would make sense if you think of it in terms of you believe enough to make the transition.
Yeah.
And then the more you believe, the more able you are to do the magic.
So that the belief is something.
The belief gets you there, the initial belief.
Right, but it's kind of a weak belief, right?
Yes.
And the more strongly you believe it.
The more strongly you believe, that learning curve for using the magic increases.
So instead of, another model would be that you just have to believe a certain amount of stuff, and then you get better by believing yet more stuff, right?
That would make sense for the model.
Well, maybe you'd have to have both then. Maybe you'd have to have you have just the outlines, the bare how the world works, but you don't really know the details of it. They go through a lot of funny stuff where they're trying to do this spell and it doesn't work out quite the way that they want, and instead of getting one thing, they get 1,000 things of this sort. And it all has to be done with language. Oh, that was another theme, so I wanted to talk about. So symbolic logic, right? It's easy to see why, at the time that they wrote these, people would have been able to use that as kind of a workable trope. Because on the one hand, philosophy was making some advances in symbolic logic. And a lot of those advances were merely just being able to symbolize things and then operate on them, and then like put them back in ordinary language again. And they were fascinated with that during the time that these guys are writing. And similar things are happening because philosophy was communicating at that time with mathematics and with physics and all these sorts of things. So it makes sense that somebody who's smart, like these guys are, would be talking about, hey, come on in. And so, but the issue is, can you really represent a world through, and the rules by which the world works, through symbolic logic? And I don't think that you really can with the kind of symbolic logic that they're using. Maybe there is another, more developed one that we
isn't the
use.
idea of symbolic logic to define our world?
Well, it's used for a couple things.
If you're using it,
Yeah.
even in within our construct,
Yeah.
our reality, it's designed to describe behavior and the laws of a particular interaction.
It's supposed to let us do more than that. You're right. It's intended to symbolize, but it's intended to symbolize so that we, in some way, we can operate on it, and we can judge the true from the false. We can, we can arrive at decisions. It's very tough to do in practice.
But defining true from the false is defining the world.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That defines the world.
Yeah.
I had to take symbolic logic because I started out a math major in college.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But I always saw it as another way to define the world, to define the rules of the world.
And that actually was one of the goals behind the people who were making the big advances in symbolic logic, was they thought that you would be able to apply it to everything. Now there's another wrinkle too, which is we can talk about modal logic as well. And they didn't have access to that at the time. Modal logic deals with necessity, possibility, impossibility, these sorts of things. And so it adds new symbolism in there that we can then, say, this is, if this is possible, then this is necessary, or things like that. Now, the reason I bring it up is because I think from like the 70s, 80s, 90s, I might be mistaking the time a bit, it might have happened in the 80s, they started using this modal logic to talk about possible worlds, which is exactly what these stories are about, right? Possible worlds. And the idea was that you wouldn't use logic to define what the world was. Instead, the logic would carry across all possible worlds. These guys, the logic doesn't carry across all the possible worlds. Each world has its own peculiar logic, right?
It's a separate system.
Yeah.
If I may interrupt real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was struggling to understand in the beginning of the book what exactly the methodology or like tool was.
Yeah,
like,
the syllogism mobile.
Yeah, the syllogism.
Yeah.
So I know he was doing if X and he was doing a bunch of stuff like that. So does he just go one by one until something snaps and then he's transported somewhere? Or I didn't quite
Yes, so
understand
that's the beauty of writing fiction, right? You can telescope all this stuff in, because to begin with, if he was going to give us a full list, it would occupy a lot of pages, and I don't know if these two guys, Pratt and Sprague de Camp, could have actually come up with it. What is the complete outline for the world of
for a world.
for Irish mythology or or Norse mythology, you know.
I mean, did they just like write it down on a piece of paper and then plug it in like a black box and then they're there?
They write it down on the piece of paper and then they read through it themselves to put themselves in the mental framework of believing that that's really the case, that's the way the world is.
Okay.
So imagine like, I mean, here's a silly example, right?
So because it reflects within your own mind, you're transported.
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah. Now, I mean, a silly example of this would be the guy who told you to, you know, every morning get in front of the mirror and say, every day in every way I'm getting better and better and better, right? So people actually did this in the 70s and the 80s, and I think even maybe before
Still
that.
do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was even a great like SNL spoof of it that Phil Hartman used to do, and it does work for some people, but I don't know that it works that long. I mean, you feel a little bit better, and you walk around, and you're in kind of a changed world. It's not the crappy world that you thought it was. Now it's a world where you can get by, but then you meet your first like obstacle, and that whole like, I don't know, mindset that you put yourself in falls apart. These guys are doing something that allows them to be in that world and then no longer have to keep
Thinking about it.
Yeah, they don't have to maintain that. They've shifted in a certain way. Now, how the hell that happens? You know, could we do that? That's part of what we've been talking about. I don't think so. I think that he's talking about a very interesting imaginative possibility that, you know, when we think it through, it's just not coherent. But it's great fiction, you know.
It's really well written. I was surprised.
Yeah. Actually, one of the critics of it said, there's parts of it that don't hold together, but it's great screwball fantasy. And screwball is like, you know, Mel Brooks and things like that, where, you know, it's very funny. But if you poke at it too much, it doesn't really hold together, you know. But I don't think they even really meant it to do so. Yeah. So, you know, language occupies a kind of weird place in this, right? Because you have to symbolize things through language, and then all the magic is done through language to some degree. But can you really represent or act upon the world through language in the way that they're portraying it? And notice too that they're not logicians; they're all psychiatrists or psychologists. You know,
The one is like a mathematician, though.
Which one? Bayard, maybe.
The older guy.
Oh, Chalmers.
Yeah, Chalmers.
He's a psychologist too.
Yes.
He's running their institute. What were you going to say?
Well, I was saying the timing within which this was written, these were written mostly, is the same time frame within which A. Merritt was writing with his various worlds. He wrote a number of books about different worlds, and Nightlife of the Gods was written at that time, which is very screwy, very madcap kind of thing.
Yeah.
All of which require pretty major suspension of disbelief. You know, they're possible, but I don't know exactly the word I'm looking for. There's more.
It's not just a question of whether it's possible. It's got to be made plausible, right?
Yeah.
That's so we have two different modalities there. And how does the writing manage to do that? I mean, we could say it tricks us in a way, right? And precisely when you ask questions like, well, how exactly is this supposed to work? How is this supposed to translate in our own experience? That's when we start to see, you know, if we're going to use another metaphor, we start to see like that there's a stage and it's actually a bunch of what do they call it? Not props, but the scenery. You know, it's not a real background that we can look into. It's just a painted background. There's actually a great expression: on a painted nail, only a painted coat can be hung. You know, but you can hang a painted coat on it. It's just that you're stuck within that frame. There was another book actually that De Camp wrote early on where he's doing alternative history. It was called Lest Darkness Fall, and it's similar to Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. This guy's visiting the Pantheon. He finds himself transported to Rome in the year 535 AD. And I put a note in here about that because, again, it's playing with the same idea of like being in a different setting, you know. Although there, it's just going back in time. With this, you're actually in a different world, right?
Well, in this, you've got both aspects, really. Because Norse mythology, Celtic mythology, happens in a different time frame in history.
Yeah, earlier civilization, that's true.
I'm about halfway through, and I remember like a few pages before they were talking about how like, well wait, if we go back, it'll be like the 25th century or something.
Oh, there's a discussion in there about, you're right, about, this is Chalmers who's carrying it out, he's saying, so, you know, imagine these things as being at right angles to each other, and he's using pencils to represent them. And he says, this is why, like, in fairyland, somebody's in fairyland for a couple days, and then he shows up much later, you know, like a couple years have passed. So they're worried about those sorts of...
you see that in all sorts of works.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Works like that. One of the standard laws of the land of fairy is when you enter the land of fairy, a lot more time passes on the outside than on the inside. People who go into the land of fairy, when they come out, it's much later.
See, and there you're talking about the relation between the two worlds, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the time ratio? And so it's not just what are the laws of this world. You could say some of the laws of fairy are laws that pertain just to that world, but then that one would be a law that has to do with the bridge between the worlds, right?
Well, or just the law within the land of fairy is that time moves at a different rate.
Well, it only moves at a different rate in relation
to the other one, yeah.
In the land of fairy, it's still all moving at the same rate. So it's locally correct, let's say, or locally, I don't know, continuous. No, that's not the right word either, because it's all continuous. It's locally consistent, and then when you go back to the other world, there's kind of a jarring effect, and that brings up a problem too. You know, it sounds almost like I'm complaining about these novels, and that's not at all the case. I'm trying to think about how this would work. I really enjoy them myself, but you have these love relationships across the worlds. Right? People can fall in love with each other, which I guess makes sense, right? I go to somebody else's country, I can fall in love with them, and then either I become a resident there, or I bring them over here and we get a green card or something like that. And that's happening with in the very first one. In the second one, Befelga comes across to the Earth, to this real world, and she's in love with Shea, and Chalmers also has this woman who's made of snow for a long time, and I can't remember her name. You haven't gotten that far into it, I imagine.
Not quite, no.
Okay, yeah, and he's trying to figure out how he can keep her from melting.
He doesn't succeed in converting her fully?
He does eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, but now the real question is, so they move out of their world into this world. How are they able to make that transition? Is it just somebody pulling them along by the hand? They're not using a syllogism mobile, and then when they're in love with somebody, is love the sort of thing that can just like overcome whatever sort of world systems we're in? So if you're in love with somebody in one world, you're in love with them in all possible worlds, perhaps.
It's the magic's magic. I don't have to explain anything. It just works.
Well, in terms of the person who's come from this world into another one,
yeah,
you already have in your head the logic of this world.
Yes.
The reality of this world.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of remembering, maybe.
Well,
the
it's not a problem for them,
construct.
right?
It's not a problem for them.
Yeah.
It's how do you get
How do you get your lover?
How do you
into
get your
the
lover
other-
or your whoever
Yeah.
across?
Yeah, and there is that reminds me. There's also a thing in there too, where Befelga's forgotten who Shea is, and that she's in love with him as well. Now, reawakening that. I mean, it seems like that love then has to be some sort of constant that survives across world shifts, right? So whatever logic you have for describing this world and then this world and this world, love has to work the same way in all the worlds.
Do you ever watch this show, Once Upon a Time?
I've watched a few episodes, yeah, but
Because
I haven't watched it regularly.
there's a construct in that series where you have multiple worlds.
Okay.
There's the world of Wonderland, there's the world of, Alice in Wonderland, et cetera.
Yeah.
But when people cross worlds, in some cases, they don't remember who they are.
Well,
But,
okay, yeah.
but the connection, the love connections,
The emotional connections?
the emotional connections still exist if they find each other.
Okay.
So when they cross into a world of no magic, this world, they have different identities, different, living situations, professions, etc. But the love connection still exists. So when
Does it apply just to love, or does it also, say, apply to hate or
it
revenge?
does, it applies to all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, it applies to all of that. So, for example, when Cinderella and Prince Charming, not Cinderella, when Snow White and Prince Charming finally connect,
Yeah.
the connection still exists.
So that would imply that in a certain way, our emotional attachments and responses, again, span across different logics. Maybe they fall outside of it.
Because consciously, they don't know that they're those two people, those
Okay.
two characters. But the love, the emotion continues to be there.
Okay.
So that plays out in the different worlds within the Once Upon a Time multiverse as people move across worlds.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound very similar to what's going on here.
I think there's a lot of consistency across a lot of these authors.
How so?
Well, when you talk about developing multiverses,
Yeah.
I think there seem to be some pretty standard
Oh, like the tropes that they all use?
rules in terms of how these things unfold. There's some differences.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some, because there's that creative aspect of they're all going to put their own
There's
spin
a different
on it,
spin
right?
on it, yeah. But there's some real similarities when you're talking about anybody who's writing a multiverse.
Yeah.
There seem to be some real similarities. Now, whether that's because it has to work that way, or they're inspired a certain way,
Or they're influenced by the
or
other
they're influenced
people,
by the
yeah,
other
yeah.
people.
I mean, what I do like about this, and you might be able to say something more about this too, is the Camp and Pratt are trying to be as consistent as possible about how the magic actually works, like a sort of technology. The rules once learned, you can actually apply them, and the spells that they have Shea and then Chalmers do later, they do make sense within that framework. Even though the mistakes make sense, and they provide explanations of why the mistakes turn out the way that they do, right? So that's kind of fun, and thinking about why that's fun. Is it that just we like some sort of order, that makes sense, even though it's a totally imaginative order,
Maybe it's the best way that the author can construct something that would be understandable to the individual that would be reading it, because otherwise it's you can't comprehend it, or it's hard to convey.
It has to make sense.
If it was too experimental, you could say, then nobody would buy it in these pulp magazines, right?
Maybe. I didn't even know this was written in 1940. I just read the date.
Yeah, they were originally in pulp magazines, in Unknown, and then later on in fantasy fiction and beyond fantasy fiction. So, that was a audience that would not, they'd be familiar with a lot of sort of tropes, but they would not be willing to let you be so experimental that they have no idea what the hell you're talking about, right? So, yeah.
You have to be able to relate to it, or else
Well, again, so that
get
comes back to the
lost.
emotional stuff. You've got these characters who are quite compelling. Harold Shea, the very first story is him, and he's a little bit too overconfident because he's compensating for stuff. He never really settles down to work on a project the way a good clinician would, and he gets thrown into the world of Norse mythology, has a rough time at first, and then gets his bearings, and he comes out of it, and he's a changed man at the beginning of the second novel, and he has real confidence, and that's what convinces Chalmers that it actually works. That he's like, well, people don't change in personality over just a day or two. Clearly, you've been gone for quite a while and have gone through some stuff. And then he's that way the rest of the time. And it's also fun that they make room for the other characters. The first one is just Harold Shea, and the other characters, Heimdall and Odin and Thor and those types. But then Chalmers, has has his role. The Czech guy, Vaclav, begins to play an important role. Each of them and the women characters too, Florimel and Belphega. So another thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of magic as technology. Is that the best way to understand it? You're talking about alchemy before.
Mm-hmm.
There's another book out, and I don't remember the guy's name, but he's from here in Wisconsin. He's over in Madison. He just won some sort of award. And
That's Rothfuss.
Is it? Well, he's the guy who talks about the flight. These are people who are carrying out magic, but they call it empirical philosophy.
No, that's somebody else then.
Yeah, this is very recent.
That's somebody else then.
And it works by, doing the sort of things that magic does, using certain powders and glyphs and all that. But it's being understood as philosophy that actually does work. And in it's sort of like the women are better at it than the witches are better than the warlocks, and men don't really do flight much, and of course the hero's a guy and he has to learn how to fly.
Yeah, that's a different author. That's not Rothfuss.
But I like the idea of it being experimental philosophy in the sense of, you try out these things, and if you're in the right kind of environment, doing this thing produces this result, right? Putting these powders together with this formula and doing it at this right time
Creates this result.
Yeah, and it does it according to certain laws. So magic becomes sort of like a substitute for technology there, right? It's like the opposite of the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, though, right? Mark Twain, the Connecticut Yankee, goes back in time, and he sets up batteries and electrifies knights, and everyone's like, "Wow, this guy is such a great magician," But he's really just using
It's just technology.
Exactly. Yeah. So
when I raised alchemy is the same kind of thing. If you put these things together, and
you should get this sort of result.
You get this
right?
result. To make gold, you do these things, and you get gold.
Yeah.
To make a ruby, you do these things, and you
I'm
end up with a
just
ruby.
laughing because I'm thinking back to my high school chemistry class, which was terrible, quite honestly, and it was an honors chemistry class. So, we had that graph paper that you'd have to write lab reports. So we would do all these experiments, and invariably about half the class, the experiments would fail. Now, what is the purpose of a chemistry experiment? It's not just to keep the kids busy for an hour. You're supposed to be demonstrating to them that science really works the way that we say that it works, right? Doing so experientially. And if an experiment is a real experiment and it doesn't go the way you're saying it's supposed to go, you're supposed to derive some results like, well, maybe when you put these things together, this doesn't actually work this way, and the scientific, reasoning, there's something wrong with it. We never did that. We would have the instructor would go to the board and he would tell us, here's what your lab report should say. Those of you who didn't get these results, you're going to use these numbers. And so what lesson did we actually learn? Science is made up. I mean, that's not true, but that would be the...
You didn't learn that it failed because I put in 2 grains too much of this chemical.
Well, I think
or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there must have been some sort of error that we were making, some minor thing, but if we were following the sort of scientific mindset strictly, we should have drawn the conclusion that science only works part of the time, but we didn't, because a lot of it really is sort of like what people believe rather than what's been demonstrated. So if magic was going to work the same way, in a different world, maybe you could snow people into thinking you're a great sorcerer or something, which is what they do.
Mm-hmm.
You'd still have to you'd have to do some tricks that actually work, but Chalmers and Shea, they're kind of, to put a not too blunt a thing, they're kind of bullshit artists in a way. They encounter these much tougher magicians and they bluff them until they've actually acquired the skills.
As does the Connecticut Yankee.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, yeah. And he actually tells them that he is doing magic.
Mm-hmm.
Although, I haven't read that book since I was a kid,
but he's a real bluffer.
Doesn't he have like a cadre of young guys who he brings up and teaches, like mechanical engineering and electricity too? That people who are in on the know,
I don't remember that.
Or in the know about what he's doing.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Do you remember offhand? Yeah. I mean, there's nothing like that happening in these. One of the other things I did want to talk about, too, as a philosophical theme, is the humor that's involved in this. It really is funny stuff, They're constantly cracking jokes, and the way the story is told, the narration is humorous. Would it be as good of a story if it wasn't, or with the stories in general, would they be as good if they didn't have so much goofing around and wordplay and if it was just straight serious stuff, What do you think?
If they played up the seriousness a little bit more, I think they would be good.
Yeah,
But I prefer the humor.
Yeah,
I think it goes it can go either way. It depends on the author and what they're trying to do with the story. Some of the serious plays very well, depending on how it's written.
yeah.
Other times the humor is really.
If you do the serious though, isn't there more of a risk of people like looking at the way, like how they got there, or the way the worlds are constructed, and saying this really doesn't add up?
Except when you're reading it, it's fantasy.
Okay.
I mean, you don't pick it up thinking it's science.
Well, if you do,
you don't pick it up thinking this is a textbook
right?
for physics, for quantum physics. You pick it up knowing that you're reading fantasy. So you automatically suspend disbelief.
That's kind of an interesting idea. Imagine that a person picked this up and they didn't know. Let's say it was actually like in the nonfiction section. Somebody was kind of gullible and they pick it up, and it was written, in a way that's a little less dialogical.
Whimsical.
Yeah. And it was written as, there were these people, and they figured out how to get from one world to the other. And here's the theory behind it. And they went into Norse mythology, and these things happened. And, and then they went to, the world of Spencer's Fairy Queen, which turns out to have been a real world after all. Could a person read this and think that these things actually did happen? I mean, we're doing that a little bit in order to make the story work, right?
Yeah, you could, because there are plenty of people out there writing that the Holocaust never happened.
Oh, yeah, true.
You know,
True,
I mean,
yeah.
there are things out there that are being written that people buy into that worldview.
There was a very interesting exchange I saw on Twitter today, and it was by a guy who taught at a community college, and he was talking about the fact that most of his students had never heard of Dachau.
Mm-hmm.
And he started sort of exploring, this is going like through a couple of years, he started exploring what it is that the students come, some of them knowing and some of them not knowing at all, and how not knowing certain things deprives you of a frame of reference for that you need in order to make sense of what's being taught. Like he talks about another, or it wasn't him, it was somebody else commenting on it, talked about how a student asked in class, and they were discussing like the Depression or something, and the student asked, what's the difference between Republicans and Democrats? Because I don't know what the difference is. And the student literally couldn't make sense. They're struggling, but they couldn't make sense of a lot of the information that was being given to them because they were lacking that background.
It was a background, not like the politics are the same sort of thing.
Well, except
I know some people argue that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, some of it would be political, right?
Well, but
And then-
historically, you'd also have to know that what is now Republican used to be Democratic.
Well, sure, yeah.
In the
but
South.
there were some switches.
The
Yeah.
Dixiecrats
yeah,
in the South were Democrats,
Yeah,
You know, Whig Party.
and then it switched.
yeah.
It flipped. And if you don't know that history, and I know plenty of people who are out there on Facebook and stuff
Oh, yeah.
who really don't know that history, who don't.
They call that cultural literacy. And it's sort of like having like a constellation of things.
Well,
Yeah.
when I taught graduate school
Yeah.
in business, in an MBA program, I had lots of students who had no idea we had a recession in the 80s.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Who,
I know because my dad complains about it.
and knowing about the recession in the
Yeah.
80s, though,
Yeah,
informs financial decisions today if you know about it. If you don't know what happened and you don't know why it happened or the various variables that contributed to it, you can make decisions today that
yeah.
are,
Well, and that's a good one too,
They
because
repeat history.
that doesn't just have to do with, say, economic history, but also with political history.
political history, yeah.
What's going on in the culture. You
Mhm.
know, yeah, and so there's all sorts of things like that. I guess actually that's an interesting question. How much cultural literacy would you need in order to make a set of stories like this really work for you?
Mhm.
Can you read this if you don't know anything about Norse mythology and come away from it with a decent enough story? I mean, when you've got like a movie, it's fairly easy because you got visual images, right? So guys are fighting with swords or something, right? That's not that hard to relate to. You may not know why the hell they're fighting or who the good guy is, right?
I think for the Norse mythology, if they defined Aesir is like gods,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of them, and then giants are, if you don't know what a giant is, a tall person, like, they're
Yeah.
like, well, I guess in this sense that like a monster.
They're huge.
A monster.
Yeah.
Star Wars.
Though, with some of this though, so gods, right? That would be tough to wrap their head around for quite a few people in our culture who, like, say, grew up in a very conservative Christian household where there's no plural gods.
It's heresy.
Yeah. I mean,
I grew up in a place like that. I mean, if they reference any sort of Old Testament like historical things, like
true.
they'll
Yeah.
understand
The
like,
pagan gods. Yeah.
other
yeah,
people, at least in the past, worship multiple
Other gods.
deities.
Yeah, that's true.
Multiple
Yeah.
gods, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well then that would work then. Yeah.
But I do think you have
If
to have
someone
a,
was sorry.
I think for it to make sense, though, you do have to have a certain level of cultural
Literacy.
literacy.
Yeah. I mean,
Especially when you're going from world to world to world.
To know the difference between
To know the difference between them.
Yeah, I mean, a good storyteller is giving you some of the reference points that you need, not just by referring to them, but by explaining them. You know, you have the characters, oh, what's that about? You know, and then they explain it in dialogue, right? And even schlocky TV shows do that. You know, my wife likes to watch Criminal Minds, and we joke around about it because, boy, is it you know, the writing is just so straightforward, in your face, you know exactly what they're doing at each point, right?
Which is not how it really works.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, you have these implausible discussions between FBI profilers where they're basically telling each other about how profiling works and you know what the really, you know, what this sign indicates and stuff like that, which would never happen, I think, in real life. Maybe if they're talking with somebody who doesn't understand the stuff, it would. But it's a great narrative technique, and you know, Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt use it quite a bit in here.
Well, I'm just thinking, if you didn't have a certain level of cultural literacy with de Camp,
Yeah.
when you shift the worlds, they would have to do a lot of explaining.
Yeah.
Just to get into the story.
Some of these are kind of obscure, too. I mean, Norse mythology is probably more accessible, more widely accessible, I would say, than, you know, Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen.
I'd never heard of Fairy Queen.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I've read the Fairy Queen. I've never read Orlando Furioso.
I would say Orlando Furioso is the one that I drew a blank on.
Okay.
Fairy Queen, even though it may not be Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, the world of fairy exists in multiple genres of fantasy.
Well, I mean, just with Furioso, just think, okay, there's magic involved, there's lots of knights, lots of flowery language, and, you know, it's very, you know, sort of high chivalry kind of
Very
stuff.
Camelot.
No, beyond that almost. You know, like think about, you know, almost obnoxiously so.
Well, and Finnish mythology would be pretty obscure for most people.
Oh, and you know, at the time, even more so. I mean, I think the literate public of the 40s and 50s, okay, they probably would know quite a bit about
Norse
mythology, about Spenser, about, you know, Coleridge, Orlando Furioso. They probably would know a little bit about Irish. I don't think they know anything about Finnish stuff. You know,
well, even today, a lot of people don't have no idea about Irish mythology, Celtic mythology.
Yeah.
I love those players.
What's that?
I love that team, the Celts.
The Celts. The Celtics.
Yeah.
The Celtics.
Yeah, so I guess that yeah.
You say Finnish mythology, Suomensko, right?
Well, this one in particular is the Kalevala.
Yeah.
Kalevala?
The Kalevala.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Kalevala.
But I would think very, very few people would have any familiarity.
Not at that time, and even now.
Even now.
Yeah.
I mean,
Not too much.
Not too much.
Probably a little bit more now than then, but it's not. I mean, it's not something that we're seeing references to in our pop culture the way we are with, say, Norse mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the only thing in here that we have any
is the Norse mythology.
Yeah, and that's mostly because of Thor and Loki and you know the Marvel stuff. We've had a few Viking-oriented movies come out, but there's really almost nothing in it about you know, Norse religion involved that I can think of. So yeah,
we have some Greek with the Percy Jackson movies. Greek
true.
mythology.
Yeah.
That showed up.
That's interesting
They
because
keep remaking Clash of the Titans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was the kid when I was young who, you know, had read Greek mythology and then got kind of snotty with everybody about, well, they screwed up this part of the story and this part of the story and this part of the story, and now I'm long past that, but my own kids are doing that with these because they've read the Greek mythology and they don't like it when they're playing too fast and loose in the movies with it. But I mean, you know, think about it. you can't make a good story where it's just telling the same stuff as the old stories, right? You've got to have a bit more play in it, which is what they're doing here. You know, you get to see that Heimdall is, you know, a pretty cool guy, and Thor, you know, he's okay, you know, very strong. Loki, you know, you get to see him in a certain respect. Who else do they have? Odin in there, and I think I'm leaving one out. But, you know, you get to see them in a different light than you would from the old stories. That's kind of an interesting place to leave off, too. You know, is it good? Is it better to, like, bring in, you know, these somebody else's already fabricated stories as your background, or is it better just to create something totally new? You know, or are they both perfectly legitimate strategies for writing sci-fi or fantasy? You know, I mean, if I want to set stuff in, I don't know, the Star Trek universe, people have been doing that for a long time. Now we call that fan fiction, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe I'm holding myself back if I do that.
Well, things like the Star Trek universe, at least when Gene Roddenberry was around.
Yeah. He tried to keep...
He kept it
he'd keep control on it.
He kept it reined in terms of Spock would only act this way.
Yeah.
Kirk would only do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
You couldn't stray too far from the basic model.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you could do that, but you could enforce that by whether you endorse it or not, you know. Mm-hmm. I mean, now, with fan fiction on the internet, though, I mean, anybody could write anything they want.
Yeah.
So, maybe that's a little bit different, though, than, you know, classical mythology and literature.
I think some of it, too, I was thinking, you know, they talk about how far can they stray.
Yeah.
I think some of it depends on what you know about the author and their process. For example, Diana Gabaldon, who writes the Outlander series.
Yeah.
If you know about her and her process, you know that she does a huge amount of historical research.
Okay.
Before she writes. So there's some confidence
on the reader's part
that the history is pretty close.
Okay.
It may not be perfectly accurate.
Yeah, yeah.
And she may, you know,
she's not just playing fast and loose.
She may switch a little bit of it out to make the storyline work.
Yeah.
But you can pretty much assume that the basic history is pretty solid around her characters.
Okay.
Like the Battle of Saratoga and things like that. That she's done her homework.
Yeah.
She doesn't write it without doing her homework. If you know that about the author, then you know what you're looking at.
What if they're playing more fast and loose like these guys?
Well, I say if you know about the author, then you know that that's what's happening.
Okay.
But I don't know that very many people pay that much attention.
Yeah, you'd actually have to know a lot in order to catch.
You'd have to have an understanding of the author's process.
Yeah.
I think at least I used to be a lot more into Star Wars when I was a little kid. I read a lot of the EU stuff because that's all they had at the time. And then when Disney bought it and canned 90% of the EU, like 95, 99% of the EU.
Yeah.
For good reason, in my opinion.
Yeah.
There's a lot of garbage. I mean, like inconsistencies, like
all over the place.
Yeah. But it's interesting because now, like, they have like the big things that like the biggest like to cry out was like the Thrawn trilogy and stuff like that. So they're bringing in little bits of that and some of the Old Republic stuff, but like it's still like 1% to 99. But the fact that there's any sort of mix at all is unexpected in my opinion.
Yeah, I suppose once you've done that, it's pretty hard to reincorporate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because every time you do, people are going to be like, oh, they should do this and this and this and this as well, you know? That's an interesting issue. We don't usually, you know, we're only talking about novels, but what goes on, if you think about how fast things can change within, a franchise like Star Wars, right? Where you've got movies coming out every so often. You've got a huge, massive fan fiction people are writing, some of which may catch on, most of which probably hardly anybody reads, other than the author and their friends. And then you've got cartoons, right? What else going on? Novels, right?
And graphic novels.
I mean, Star Wars was beset with a problem even from the start because of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which I read when it first came out. I loved. I thought it was a great book. Alan Dean Foster wrote he was commissioned. And there was talk for a while that would be where the series was going. And then it went the other way. So that book just became kind of like an orphan hanging out there, right? Meaning nothing. What can you do with it? And by the end of it, Darth Vader's had his arm cut off and he's thrown down a pit. Did Luke and Leia end up I think they were like kissing by the end of it, if I remember right. They're not brother and sister. So, so far away from what you could have done with, But it was a full book. It was a novel, by a big name science fiction author at the time. Yeah, and well, that's actually the good place to bring things to a close. So when Pratt died, they had some plans for more collaboration. They were going to do Persian mythology and legend. Never came off, unfortunately, and so the series just ends abruptly. De Camp tried to make it work with some other guys, other younger science fiction authors, but he could never find somebody to collaborate with the way that he did with Pratt in these stories. So this is all we're going to get. But I mean, if you think about it, this could have been a franchise, right? Because you could have done world after world after world after world, bringing in like one new character, maybe every 2 novels or something. They could have milked this forever.
You could have kind of gotten like a Mystery Science Theater vibe where it's like they're visiting all these different copyrighted things.
That's a great way to think about it. They could have like set like almost like an encyclopedia. Oh, who should we go after this time?
But it's okay and it makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the
it works within the construct.
That's the screwball part, right? I mean, think about what Mel Brooks does with his historical movies. You don't go to any of them for history, of course.
No.
But they're pretty funny, I don't know how well they stand up now. I haven't looked at any of them for a while. Maybe some of the jokes aren't quite as good as they used to be. Well, we should probably bring this to a close. We're very over time. So thanks for a great discussion again. And next time is Andre Norton and the Witch World. The first 3 novels of that series. A lot of fun.